Web app architecture is still an evolving field. I'd say the front-end user experience, that feels like it's stabilized. We all know roughly what a web UI is supposed to look and feel like. But how it's architected under the hood, that's definitely still in flux. Should we be using REST or WebSockets or GraphQL? How much rendering are you supposed to do on the browser and how much should be back on the server? How do you manage the state of a web page when these days a web page state can be so huge that it definitely needs some management? Web pages these days are complicated beasts, and so we need good architectural practices to handle them. Well, joining me with some possible next steps in the evolution of web app architecture is Hayleigh Thompson. She's a React developer and an Elm developer, two quite different frameworks into very different languages. And she's currently synthesizing her expertise into a new framework called Lustre. And Lustre adds into that mix some inspiration from the actor model. It has connections to Erlang, and there are parts of Lustre that look less like web pages and more like location-agnostic actors. How on earth does that work? And why do it? What's the upside? The upside is all in pursuit of the perfect architecture, so let's see where she's taking this. I'm your host, Chris Jenkins. This is Developer Voices, and today's voice is Hayleigh Thompson. My guest this week is Hayleigh Thompson. Hayleigh, how are you?
Yeah, I'm really good, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, very well. You've got one of my favorite topics that only became my favorite topic about halfway through my career. We can talk about. So I got into front-end programming probably around the early 2010s, just out of sheer frustration that the quality of engineering, to my mind, in my experience, caveats, was pretty terrible. Like, if it worked, you weren't supposed to complain about anything else. And I found Angular 1, which was, in hindsight, not the greatest design, but at least there was a design. And that's when I really started getting into, like, not just front-end programming, but how we can make the engineering of it sane. That was my starting point, but it's about you. So what's your starting point in the front-end world?
Well, actually, my background is in music computing and creative coding. So I actually got into web development through the web audio API.
No way.
Yeah. Like, I was teaching myself programming, and so the idea of learning C was like kind of off the table. It was a bit too complicated for me. So when I worked out that JavaScript had this API for synthesis in the browser, I kind of just ran with that. So probably in maybe 2016 is when I started. Back then I was doing a lot of C++ in open frameworks and Java, doing processing, like creative visual coding.
Processing being, that's an audio framework in Java, right?
It's more of a visual framework, actually. There's like an audio module, but at the time I was doing sort of generative art. And was kind of concurrently learning web development because it sounded interesting. Then I discovered the web audio API and started playing with that. I picked up Vue maybe in like 2018. Was doing that for a while. I like leapfrogged over React and TypeScript and all of that. Like at the time, NPM and Node and all of this was like super intimidating to me. Like I really liked that I could just drop Vue in a script tag and just work, because I didn't really understand package management or anything like that at the time.
Right.
And then in 2019, I came across Elm.
Yes.
I did like a functional programming class at university that taught me Haskell.
Yeah.
And I had seen Elm like previously, maybe a year before, and bounced immediately off it because it looked super weird, was very strange. After I did this class, I kind of came back to Elm.
Right.
There was like there was this big push at the time. It was like maybe 2019, and there was this big push from a lot of the big names in the Elm community. They were giving a lot of like conference talks. I was getting a lot of recommendations on YouTube about how Elm was solving all of these big problems of like Elm is TypeScript and React and Redux and Immutable JS and Webpack all into one thing. And I just picked that up. And the rest is kind of history. I've been doing Elm now for 5 years. And then for about a year or so now, I've been developing, in my mind, what is Elm 2 in Gleam.
Right, which is Lustre, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so we're going to get into Lustre, but the fact that you've created Lustre puts you forward as an architect of front-end design patterns, right? So I'll give you the interview question. How would you describe and contrast the way Vue does it to the way Elm does it?
Yes, that is a very good interview question.
Sorry.
No,
this is an interview,
good.
but not that kind of interview.
I think what a lot of current front-end frameworks come down to is this very kind of component-driven architecture, where in many ways you're thinking at quite a small scale. You're encouraged to say, for like, in Vue is a really good example actually, because they have these single file components, SFCs they call them, right? And so you have like the markup for your component, and then you have a script tag which encapsulates all of the logic, and then you have a style tag which starts the component. And the idea then is that by focusing at the component level, you have all of these kind of rich, interactive, sophisticated experiences, and then you compose them and you piece them together into something much larger. I think that is in stark contrast to Elm, where you have this kind of very holistic view of your application, where you think, okay, what are like the main domain types in the application I'm building, for example? Like, what does my model represent? Your model being your entire application state. And then from there, your UI, these are pure functions. Right now, you have no component state, no local component state. Instead, you have just simple building blocks to piece together your UI, which is largely divorced from your application logic, your business logic. And I think these two approaches are very, very different.
It is that dividing line almost between OO and FP, right? In one, you think of the world as broken up into little islands of objects. And in the other, you think of it as data and stuff you do to data.
It's interesting because in the Elm guide, there's like a footnote written by Evan that clearly a lot of people ask about, where are components in Elm? So there's this little footnote that's like, components are objects and we don't have objects in functional programming and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah. And how did you find it going from one model, which is probably a more popular model, the OO-ish model, going to the FP model?
Yeah, actually, the transition was in some ways predictably difficult because it's a very big shakeup of your worldview, I would say. But I was early enough in my journey in general that the kind of scale of things that I was building and working on was small enough that actually the transition to this kind of Elm approach, where you have a model that describes your whole application, actually that worked really well for me. And I actually found that transition very smooth in a lot of ways, and now feels very, very natural.
Okay. It sounds like you found it easier than I did, but I was more baked in the whole objects are everything worldview. Yeah. Okay, so So that's I think these things are less starkly different at small scales. Like you say, you're dealing with small applications. Yes, they're different, but the differences don't really show themselves until things get large. Have you worked on large Elm projects and large Vue projects?
I've not worked in large Vue projects, but I am also a React developer these days.
Okay.
So I have worked in both large Elm and React code bases.
Do you want to, without being too biased, compare and contrast?
Actually, I don't think I am that biased. I'm a really big fan of React, actually. I think especially after doing Elm for 4 years before I even looked at React. Now when I came to React, it felt like React was now giving me lots of things that I wished I had in Elm.
Oh, okay.
So I think both approaches do scale, I would say. In my experience, like I've worked in big code bases in both, and both of them have been pleasant enough. I think they both have their own pain points. But I think there's a big shortcoming in Elm's model, which is this like complete rejection to encapsulated state. This like, I would say, very dogmatic approach to encapsulated states as objects and objects as OOP and OOP is bad, which I think breaks down very quickly when you think about the DOM, when you think about the HTML that you're already rendering.
Explain that
the example,
to me.
The example I always give is the input element, right? The native HTML input element. This thing has so much state that you don't ever interact with, right? Like we set the value of it, but think about managing focus. Like if you tab into it and now it's focused, right? This is internal state. Or think about handling keyboard interaction, or just even something as trivial as like blinking. Exactly. Yeah. Placement of the cursor, like the cursor blink, like when you make a selection, like all of this stuff is handled by the browser, but it's handled as an encapsulated stateful thing. And in our LMAPs, we go, well, we don't worry about that. We're going to render the markup. And I think actually there are times, especially now in kind of modern web development, where we're really crafting like quite sophisticated applications, right? We've moved beyond documents, or at least the industry that I'm in has moved beyond documents into applications. And here you have very, very rich interactive elements on a page. And if you really want to craft like a native experience, I think it very, very quickly falls down in Elm's model, where you have to store all of that somewhere centrally.
Yes. Okay. I can buy... one place I've experienced that is trying to do maps in Elm, and they are sufficiently rich that it does start to become very difficult. But... okay, so you're not supplying enough controversy, so I'll do it, right? The polarizing line, and all programmers try and be polarizing at some point, is Elm tries to reject the existence of state except for one big global state. And I think that works quite well generally, highlighting some problems. Then you've got the other end where every tiny little thing becomes a component. And I find the problem there is every individual unit works well, but you've got this hidden graph of interactions which becomes impossible to debug. If you're saying components are sometimes good, I think that's what you're saying, how do we know where to divide up those lines?
I think a lot of it comes down to culture. I mean, so I'm going to keep hammering on about Elm because it's the thing I'm most familiar with and also the thing I have the most opinions about.
Okay.
And so like as a culture, as Elm developers, we have this rejection of encapsulated state. But if you look at big Elm code bases, or if you look at kind of complicated packages, there is this implicit recognition of, well, I have some behavior that I want encapsulated. So I'm going to put it in an opaque type, and I'm going to tell you to store it in your model, and I'm going to give you some functions to update it, and I'm going to give you a function to render it. And what we've done there is we've gone, this is sufficiently complicated that I want to hide how this works to my users, to my consumers. But Elm is not expressive enough to do that in a way that doesn't involve you breaking it into 3 isolated pieces and asking your users to wire things together. And as Elm developers, I think we have a pretty good intuition of when we should do that. Because the language and the framework itself makes it quite tedious, it's not an approach we reach for immediately. Whereas in React or Vue or Angular or Svelte, it's very easy to create a component with encapsulated state. And so the culture there is about creating many encapsulated components. So actually, I think it's quite an obvious thing to say out loud, but it's down to what the language makes easy. And if you make something hard, your users will only do it when they need to.
I'm going to play devil's advocate for the Elm team here and say the reason it makes making components hard is they're a bad idea.
But I would say that it's clear. I think it's the fair Elm line, but I think if you just take half an hour to look at things being built with Elm, they are still making components. They're just doing them. They're just doing them in a way that is technically not a component, but is functionally identical to one, right? If you publish a package or if you're working internally, if you have a module and it has its own model type and it has a message type and it has an update function and it has a view function, you have, in essence, created a component, but you can't put those pieces together yourself. So you hand the constituent parts to your users and you say, right, wire this up, but it's a black box as far as you're concerned.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm now thinking of a table library I've used in Elm, which is not as customizable as I'd like, but it's great when you just want to throw up a table with like sortable columns. And it's exactly that. I always have to double check and triple check how to install it because I'm installing it in 3 different places.
Exactly.
Okay.
Actually, the Elm community actually has a very, very big infatuation with web components as well, which is somewhat uncommon among other front-end frameworks. As I think largely as a community, as a front-end community, we kind of landed on the idea that these aren't that good anymore. But the Elm community in particular is actually very bullish on the idea of when you do have some encapsulated state, just put them in a web component and render them in your view. And I've seen people experiment with building Elm apps as web components. And I think that tells you something. That tells you that there are people that recognize when you have some sophisticated logic combined with view, that actually there's something to the idea of being able to package them up in a black box.
Because this is a web component is very much like the input tag, right? In that you just treat it like HTML, but it actually hides a whole bunch of interesting state. I can see why philosophically Elm people would be attracted to that idea because they're already using that idea in even simple form fields. But you seem to think it's not such a great idea?
I think it's an excellent idea. Actually.
Oh, okay. I've misinterpreted you.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that idea, and in fact, this is how components work in Lustre. So just to give a quick TLDR, Lustre is this kind of same model view update idea as Elm. So you have like a model of your application state, a message type that represents all the ways the world can speak to you. You update that state and you have a kind of pure view function. And kind of born out of this frustration Elm from Elm, actually what you can do in Lustre is you can take those building blocks, that model view update package, and say, okay, treat this as a web component. And it registers as a real web component that then in your like application you render as any normal HTML element. And you communicate to it. You communicate the same way that you would like native HTML. So you set attributes and the component sends you events. And so there isn't this split idea of, well, I render HTML this way and I pass data into HTML this way versus my framework has a components and I have a props object and I pass in. It's quite common these days where the idea of component is a framework specific thing that is detached from the idea of HTML. And in Lustre, these two things are operationally equivalent at the point of consumption.
Does that bring back the problem of once you've decided, because there is a nice thing separating out like the behavior from the HTML in that you get the obvious one being you can render it multiple ways, right? You can have the same underlying logic for multiple presentation types. And it sounds like you're losing that as you quite tightly wire the HTML tag to what it does.
I think it's always going to come down to API design, and that is unavoidable. So I would say that, yes, if you have committed to treating something as a component, then you have lost the ability to treat it as constituent parts. But if that functionality was valuable to you, you didn't have to make it a component, right?
Right. Yeah. Okay.
I mentioned previously that it's about culture and it's about what the framework makes easy. And so there's a bit of overhead to creating a component in Lustre because you do need to build like a full application, right? You do need that model type, you do need that init function, that message type, right? You need all of those bits. And only once you have those bits can you make them into a component, which is different to pretty much conventional front-end frameworks where you might initially start off with a function that just returns some markup. And then when you decide, actually, I need state, it's very easy to add state, right? It's very easy to turn it into a component. But the fact that Lustre kind of adds a not insurmountable but obvious hurdle means that you're discouraged from making this approach the default. Like the default approach is still always to write pure view functions. Sorry.
Okay. So you're saying if I come into Lustre, I will get largely the Elm experience, which is write some data describing my idea of the world and the way it can change, and then write some rendering code. But the option to turn it into a web component, which is like a live HTML tag, a smart HTML tag, is very much open to me.
Yes. That's pretty much that's the ideal scenario.
Okay. Is that novel? I mean, I've never actually tried in Anger to create web components in other frameworks. Is that common? That it's well supported? Do you think you do it better than anyone else?
I think the best example I can think of is Svelte. So you can compile any Svelte component to a web component, at which point Svelte has disappeared and you could use it anywhere, which is the same in Lustre. I don't think that idea is novel. I think the novelty for Lustre is actually we have this idea of universal components.
Oh, yes. Now, I want to get into that, but first we've got to have a quick sojourn into Gleam and what that offers to build it up, right? So sure. Lustre's written in Gleam, which is a language I know you love. Why Gleam and what does it offer as a front-end developer first?
Yeah, it's actually, I think that's a great question. And I think my answer will be somewhat dissatisfying.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of exciting, mature things. As a front-end developer, like, you are spoiled for choice. In my mind, the strength of Gleam is actually, if you're a back-end developer, you get access to the front end, which is less common. You get access to the front end via Gleam's JavaScript target. So for people that don't know, Gleam compiles to both Erlang. It runs on the Beam, the Erlang virtual machine, and it also compiles to JavaScript. And it's not exactly novel to have like a full stack language, but I do think if you are like a front end developer, you're spoiled for choice, and so there are reasons to choose Gleam. I would say, like, the big one for me is that Gleam is just much semantically simpler than TypeScript. Like, just the experience of using it is much lower complexity. There's a lower cognitive burden, I would say. But actually, I think the superpower is if you're a front end, if you're a back end person, and you don't really care about this front end thing, but you need a front end because everything needs a front end now. Yeah. I think the selling point then is that you get access to a front end framework written by like an excited front end developer that hopefully I know what I'm talking about. And you get to use the same language and the same concepts and the same primitives.
So is Lustre then mostly about bringing good front-end ideas into this world of people that don't necessarily have access to many front-end ideas?
That's definitely been my strategy for now. Like, interestingly, like, front-end people are a naturally curious bunch, I think. And if you're into front-end, you've almost definitely explored 10 dozen compile to JavaScript languages, and you've tried 100 different frameworks. And so actually the number of people using Lustre right now, especially say 4 months ago when Gleam had only just become version 1, the people using Lustre then were like front-end people. And so actually there's already like a community of knowledgeable people. But my focus as a kind of brand strategy, if you want to call it that, is really pushing to particularly like developers on the Beam. So like not just backend developers, but specifically like Erlang and Elixir developers. And the reason why I think that is a viable and interesting and exciting strategy is that Elm's idea of how front end should work, this model view update architecture, is just so strikingly similar to what Erlang and Elixir developers are already doing on the Beam with actors.
Yes. Yeah, there is a parallel. There's a huge parallel there, isn't there? Because it's like...
Yes.
It's all, let's treat the world as a state machine.
Exactly. It's entirely message-based functional updates of state. It's just the Elm and the Lustre thing that we just add a view function to that building block that you already have. If you're just coming,
add a pretty way to look at your actor.
Exactly. I've mentioned in talks I've given in the past, I just frame it as your front end is another actor, but not an actor in the Beam. Right now, this actor lives in the browser, but it's the same. You still send messages to it. It still has an update loop. And I think for a lot of those kinds of developers, that's a real light bulb moment, because it's like, hey, this kind of approach to building applications that I'm already familiar with, like, I don't need to learn a new idea to build the front end, right? Like, I still need to learn how to put HTML together. But in terms of creating an application that has behavior, you're already doing what you need to.
Yes. Yeah, and it's interesting because that's exactly the flip side of the coin of where I started out where people knew how to generate pretty looking HTML, but there was no fundamental underlying architectural pattern to make it sane. You're turning that on its head and saying, here's the architectural pattern. Now all you need to do is to make it look good, which I always outsource to a designer with like giving me Photoshop documents anyway. So, and then you're just left having to center a div, but you can make that happen eventually.
Well, actually, I have a companion library.
For just centering divs.
I have a UI library that is, at the moment, it's a bit in flux, but the idea is that like it's just a UI kit if you don't know or care about front end.
You just want something consistent and
Lustre
pretty.
UI.
Right. Is that something like Bootstrap or Tailwind or something like that? Conceptually.
Yeah, I suppose so. Conceptually, yeah.
Okay.
Conceptually like Bootstrap in the idea that if you just need something that looks good and a way to put it all together.
Yeah. It's absolutely great for the prototype, and we'll hire designers if anyone complains.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, so I can certainly see that sell, especially for people who are on a back end like Beam, which there is no obvious front end framework to go to as far as I'm aware. Right. The major architectural difference there is, if I'm trying to think like an Erlang, Beam, back end Gleam developer, I'm expecting to have lots of different actors running my application. And it seems like the front end is going to largely be a single actor. Is this where the idea of making web components, how does that play out, the proliferation of actors for tasks?
I mean, that is largely it. So you would expect to have many actors in your application for sure. And in most cases, your front end, your view, that will be one actor, right? The browser. But this is the draw of Lustre's approach to components, I think, is that actually if you do need more, then you're still proliferating that same idea, that same like update loop idea into components now. And they do compose. So like I would say in your Erlang applications, your actors form a graph, right? Like you have supervision trees, but in terms of communication, you have essentially a graph of actors that can send messages to one another. The only difference with the front end then is that rather than a graph, you have a tree, right? Because you're ultimately rendering HTML.
So there is,
any of those components might be. Yeah. But the building blocks are the same. I'm going to bring it up again because I think it's the most exciting bit is that actually, well, if you have this application type, which just bundles up the idea of an actor with a view function, and you can use it as your application, and then also you can embed them, nest to them as components. And this idea is already kind of very familiar to the Beam. Why can't you just move that whole bundle as an actor on the Beam? Which is exactly what Lustre lets you do.
Take me through that. Yeah, we need to dive into that because so you've got an actor running on the front end generating HTML from a certain point of view. You want to move that to the back end. Why?
I think the most compelling argument is if you need or want direct access to some sort of back-end service, right? Like maybe you're doing real-time data visualization, or you have to me, having a real-time aspect is the real draw to this ability. But also this ability unlocks the fact that you just don't have to worry about network transport anymore, right? Like you don't have to craft an API layer on top of your database and then do some JSON serialization and then deserialize it and then turn it into HTML, right? you can run your component next to your database conceptually and just make database queries and then just turn it to HTML. So before we get too deep into that rabbit hole, let me give a little bit of grounding, or anchor it to something else that already exists. So the Elixir community has live view, which is this idea of what if we ran the entire front end as an actor on the beam. But this is for entire applications. So you would have a live view application, and then what you do is you send like a minimal runtime to the client, which sets up a WebSocket connection. And then your entire front end runs on your back end and just sends DOM patches, HTML diffs, essentially, that get
right. So the front end is just saying, user click this button, and the back end is sending back, you need to stick in a new div here.
Exactly.
Right.
And so this is how live view works. And really, live view wants you to build your entire application this way. And that's a very popular approach for Elixir developers, because they specifically don't want to deal with the front end, right? This lets them reuse everything that they already know about Elixir to make interactive front end experiences,
right.
Which is great. I think it's really, really cool tech, and it's very, very exciting, and kind of confusing that it never really caught on outside of Elixir. I think there's like a PHP library that does something similar. But I think that has a really glaring problem, that now your entire front-end interactivity is mediated over a WebSocket connection, which, as a front-end developer, seems absolutely wild to me.
As people in the UK that have talked to services that just exist in California, the latency on that too is suboptimal the further away you get.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
I think this approach is very popular in places where you have excellent internet, and also for internal tools, right? Where
yes, an intranet you wouldn't notice the difference. Yeah.
Exactly. So Lustre essentially has looked at that and gone, well, that is an excellent idea. We already have this idea of components that is conceptually compatible with how things already work on the beam. So instead of shipping our entire front end to the back end and running it over a WebSocket, why don't we just take that idea of a component and say, well, you can render it on the client as a web component, or you can run it on the back end as a server component.
And you're seamlessly doing this thing where sometimes it's actually running in the browser, and sometimes it looks like it's running in the browser, but it's DOM patches going over the wire.
Exactly. The idea is essentially, in cases where you aren't doing platform-specific code, I mean, obviously, if you write some code that uses an Erlang library, you can't run that in the browser. That's
fair.
I'm not going to solve that. But if you write your application in a platform agnostic way, so for example, if you did use an Erlang library, if you provided a JavaScript implementation, like an alternative implementation for the JavaScript target, the idea then is that you can take that app, this Gleam type that encapsulates your application update function view. You can just take that, and the only thing that needs to change then is how you start it. So you can start it as a single page application, a SPA, just calling lustre.start in the browser. You can register it as a web component, or you can register it on the back end as a server component. And the idea is that your application code never changes. Like, you could put that in a separate project or publish it as a package and say, hey, you can choose where this runs.
Okay. Would you also be able to start off saying, I'm trying to think of a scenario here. So I start off with something that's a local intranet project, and I do it all rendered on the server side. Eventually, I decide to spin out some part of it to the public. Can I then, 18 months down the line, start to push some, if not all, of the application out to be genuinely on the front end?
Sure. Like this is when you would lean into components. So we had that discussion, right? Kind of debating whether this idea of encapsulation of state is a good or a bad thing, whether this is a naughty or a dirty thing. But actually, when you draw that hard component boundary, right, you say this is a black box that is encapsulated. Well, the benefit of making it a black box is that from the parent's perspective, it doesn't need to know. So if you wanted to start with your application fully rendered on the client, for example, as a single page application, you do that and then you go, okay, actually, I have some complicated piece of functionality, so I'm going to make that into a component because there are like engineering benefits to doing that, right? It's easier for me to think about this as an encapsulated thing. So you do that, and then 9 months down the line, you think, oh, actually, this would be way better if I could just run it next to my database. Because you already drew that component boundary, the parent already doesn't care. Like it's not the parent's concern where the component is rendered anymore. Like it just says, I want to render my counter component. Counter is a really rubbish example because you would never make a counter component, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
And so then at that point, it's just an implementation detail of the counter where it renders. So you just say, okay, well, now I'm going to swap out that for a server component, and I'll move my counter to the back end.
What does that actually involve in practice? I mean, what things am I typing to make it now appear on the back end instead?
So in Gleam projects, full stack Gleam projects are essentially organized as a monorepo. So you have a back end Gleam app, you have a front end Gleam app. And typically I suggest people have a third Gleam project for their shared code, like for types and serialization and that kind of stuff that you want to share between both projects.
Okay.
And so let's say you have this counter component. You've made it's in your front end project.
Yeah.
Because that's where it was. So you have a module, it's got the init, the update, the view function. It's all neatly bundled up into its own thing. Currently in the client kind of like main setup function, you have a call to Lustre register and you say, call it my component, and you give it your component app. And now that's registered as a custom element. So the process of moving that to the back end is removing that call, because you don't need to register it as a custom element anymore. Copying that counter probably to your shared project now, or you could move it straight to the back end. Like you would move the code somewhere else so that you have access to it from your back end.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then from your back end, you set up a WebSocket handler.
Mm-hmm.
And when that WebSocket initializes, you call Lustre start server component. And now that spins up an actor that speaks over a WebSocket. And then the only thing that changes in the client then is you render a custom element called Lustre server component and you point it to your WebSocket endpoint.
Okay.
And so like if you organize this properly, essentially that would be hidden through a function call. So you would have a function that is like counter.view, right?
Yeah.
Just from the counter module, you would call that, or counter.element, or whatever you call it. And you would just swap out the implementation there. So the parent doesn't even need to change at that point.
Okay. So let me ask you a couple of quick practical questions on that. Do I need one WebSocket per component, or am I reusing a single WebSocket across the whole project?
Currently, well, so actually compared to LiveView, this whole approach in Lustre takes a step back from being tied to any particular web server or transport layer or protocol. And so you could actually use the same WebSocket for anything, because it's your responsibility to essentially hand the data from the WebSocket to the server component runtime. And this is a negative in the sense that it's a little bit more boilerplate as an author, but it's a positive because now you are in complete control over how that works. So you could swap out the WebSocket for HTTP long polling or server sent events, or I mean, if you were crazy, you could wire the whole thing up as a REST API, right? Like the server component runtime doesn't actually care. Like,
okay, I'm gonna run it over a Kafka topic then, or RabbitMQ, something like that, something crazy. Yeah.
Typically, you would use one socket per component, but only because that would be the easiest or least complicated approach. But there's nothing stopping you technically from using one socket for all components on a page.
Okay. So the multiplexing is my job, but it doesn't sound like that hard a job. The other question is sessions. Are you automatically taking care of the fact that 50 front-end users are running 50 components on your server?
No.
Okay.
At this point, basically, what Lustre gives you is an actor that represents your application runtime, and then the rest of the job is you. Like Lustre's job is purely about rendering, essentially.
Okay. So I'm expected as a back-end author. Sorry.
Exactly. Yeah. Like Lustre really, the bit that I'm knowledgeable about is the front-end application bit. And so the fact that it's running on the back end is kind of an implementation detail. Like as an author, you maybe don't know so much about front-end rendering. So you use Lustre, but you know more than me about building your back end. So I'm not going to have opinions on that.
Like, okay.
And I think this is a benefit. Like Gleam's general approach in both the language and as a community is like to minimize magic. And so that often manifests as slightly more work as a user, slightly more boilerplate. But if you can get over that initial gut reaction of, boilerplate is the worst, like I want all the fancy things to do it for me. If you can just get over that, actually what you get is a very simple experience and one that you have a lot more control over.
Generally, in the long run, I favor that approach. Yeah. Okay, so what about, I should do a couple more checks on the practicalities of this. So what about continuously nesting? It sounds like I'm okay if I take a client-side component that contains a server-side component that contains a client-side component. Is it just going to work?
Exactly. It will just work.
Okay, cool.
Which I think is like that is so magical. Like I think that is the really cool part. The ideal scenario that I have in my head that I always tell people is like you have like an admin dashboard or some sort of like admin dashboard, right? And you have that as a single page application because you want like snappy navigation, and it makes sense to render this on the client first. But then inside that you have, say, a really data intensive table. Like maybe you have a table for your 1 million users registered to your startup, your SaaS app, right? And so you make that into a component because you want to handle like filtering and search and ordering and that kind of thing. You just want to encapsulate that. So you make that a component. And then inside that table, you render like a search input that handles like focus trapping and autocomplete and suggestions. And so you make that a component itself, right? So right now you have your single page app, a table component, and inside like an autocomplete search. The really, really neat thing is that you can go, well, this table, like I'm spending a lot of time making a whole backend service for like querying my users, and I'm adding pagination and filtering. And I have this whole REST API, and I'm doing like JSON encoding and then decoding. Yeah. So you go, okay, well, why don't I take this table and render it as a server component? Because then, I skip out that whole layer and I can just make database queries and I can just speak directly to the database.
Yeah.
But the table is still rendering a client component, right? It's still rendering that autocomplete input. And so you have all of the benefits of client rendering there. Like you're not worrying about WebSocket latency at that point or anything like that, while getting all of the benefits of the renderer being next to your database, while getting all the benefits of your application still running on the client.
Yes. You might have just found a solution to the age-old war of thin client, thick client. Because each has pros and cons, and you're saying you can pick and choose which pros and cons you want on a component level.
Yes, and because components are conceptually larger than they are in React et al., you don't get stuck in the same sort of debates or stuck in the same sort of pitfalls that you might do if you had this ability in, say, Vue. Like, it would be crazy if you could turn every single React component into a real-time thing that ran on the server and they could arbitrarily nest. Like, that would just be like an absolute explosion in complexity and engineering effort, right?
Right.
Because components are working on a far too granular scale in those frameworks. But because Lustre components they encapsulate a lot more, right? Like, then actually some of the operational downsides to doing this, like there is a bit of setup, right? That cost feels a lot lower because you're getting a lot more out of one sort of little component.
Okay, so you're saying there's a natural push away from components, but which isn't like a law, like it almost is an Elm, but it's just when you don't make it the easiest path, then you don't get the same proliferation of components. But the option's still there if you need the power. Yeah,
that's exactly it. And honestly, I find that when I'm making things in Lustre, like I'm using components sparingly. Like there's a bit of setup to them, and also you just kind of don't need it in, say, 80% of scenarios. Like the Elm approach works super nicely for like 90-95% of things. So like don't fix what isn't broken. The bit that's broken is that the 5% where you really do want a component, you can't have an Elm.
Yes. Okay. So do you have any guidance for where those boundaries lie? Because that's a question that faces every framework. Like, what is the component boundary?
I'm not sure I have any real rules right now. The framework is still young, and also this idea of components is still young. When I first started on Lustre, we didn't have components. Like, it was a pretty faithful Elm implementation. And so the framework now is maybe technically a year old, probably practically more like 6 to 8 months old. And so I think there's a lot of learning, like as a community, working out where those boundaries are. Because there is this overhead to setting a component up, right? You do need a message type. Like, I think the message type is the bit that tells you whether this really needs to be a component or not. Like if you only have, say, 2 messages, you're not really encapsulating a lot of complicated interaction here. And so the benefits of setting this whole thing up as an application, so a self-contained application, is quite slim. You've gone through all that work just to hide the fact that this component responds to button clicks or something.
Yeah.
But as soon as I don't really want to give like a precise number, because I don't think that's the kind of heuristic that is practical. But as soon as you get to like say 5 messages, 5, 7, 10 messages, like at this point you're clearly dealing with something that operates in its own world and receives messages from the outside world specific to it. And then I think it starts feeling a bit more natural to turn this into a component.
Yeah,
which is
see that
a very unsatisfying way of saying I'm not entirely sure what that boundary is. But I do know that Lustre pushes that boundary further away than React or Vue or Svelte do. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, puts it on a high shelf that you can still reach, but you won't habitually. It's like that trick where you put the biscuits, you put the cookies on the shelf you can't quite reach.
Yeah, exactly. If you really, really want the cookie,
yeah.
If you really want the cookie, you can get it.
Yeah, but you won't do it unthinkingly. So I have one more question about this in practice, which is, if I've not really had a great experience trying to write web components, and if I just thought, okay, I'm going to get into this just for the one feature of hopefully it's an easy way to make web components and publish them in a language of my choice for other people who don't care what language it's written in to use, is Lustre on Gleam a good choice?
It's certainly a choice.
Okay.
I would say that this functionality or this particular scenario is something that I did have in mind when I was working on this feature. So to rewind a little bit, Lustre has a companion DevTools package that runs on Erlang. Like the thought process here being that like most of these developers like not needing Node, not needing npm, that's a selling feature. So there's a DevTools package for Lustre that includes a bundler and a dev server and some other stuff, but relevant to this conversation is it includes a bundler, and specifically it includes a command to bundle a web component. So you can actually take any Lustre component and say, hey, build this as a component, and then you get a JavaScript bundle that you can just include on any web page.
And then I just write a regular old HTML tag, and it's magic.
Exactly.
Okay.
So there are some caveats. There are some caveats to that, and some problems inherent to web components, I would say. So Lustre puts in a bit of work to make it so that you, as an author, don't need to know that a component is a web component. In so much as styling web components is difficult in the web component world.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is the phrase web component refers to more than one specification. So there's the custom element spec, which is having these custom HTML tags with their own logic, etc. It also refers to this idea of the shadow DOM, which is this way of hiding what the component renders to the parent so that you can't reach in and manipulate it using like a query selector, for example.
iframes 2.0.
Shadow DOM is exactly. Shadow DOM is excellent. It's really, really good. But when you register a shadow DOM, what you actually have also done is isolated the styles of the component from the parent. And this is both a blessing and a curse.
Yeah.
This is excellent because it means that you can create a component with its own like styles, and then you could drop it in a different web page and guarantee that it's not affected by that page's styles. Like it looks how you authored it.
Yes.
But the problem, of course, is if you want to use Shadow DOM and you want to use it in your own web application, so you're not actually worried about conflicting styles. Now, typically, as an author, if you are building these in JavaScript, for example, you have to pay attention to how they're styled. And there are ways to have styles pierce the Shadow DOM. So typically you would use CSS variables, but there's also like a shadow root CSS selector But the point I'm making here is that you have to be aware of this, and then you have to essentially work around it. So Lustre does some work to work around this for you so that you never need to understand or even know. And the way that manifests is essentially where we can, we adopt style sheets from the parent document, and where we can't, we clone them into the component. So for example, like if you have like an external link tag for some style sheet hosted somewhere else, that gets cloned into the component so that the component has access to all of those styles as well, which works great if you're building a Lustre app and you want components. This works less great if you're building a component without an app and you want it to be styled in a self-contained way. So I would put back to you and anyone else that's interested in this scenario is please try it, and then please tell me what you need to make it work nice, because I don't think anyone is doing this right now. Like, the functionality is there and the dev tools have had the forethought to include the way to bundle them, but I don't think anyone is actually doing it right now.
Right. Needs user testing.
Yeah.
Okay. Then that brings us to what must be the last and inevitable question. If someone wants to get started with Lustre, where do we start?
The documentation, I put a lot of effort into this. Like, it's still a work in progress, but I put a lot of effort into the docs. So if you go to lustre.build, that will just redirect you to the package API on Hex. And there's like a guide, like a long form written guide that will kind of take you from zero to like a complete app that does side effects, HTTP requests, all of that. There's also a quick start guide. There's also an ordered number of examples that each build on complexity. If you don't want to do a lot of reading and you just want to look at code, there's a bunch of examples as well. And there are cheat sheets if you're coming from React or LiveView or Elm.
Oh, wow. Okay, you have done your homework.
Yeah, I really want people to use this thing,
Cool. So one last question. What are you using it for? Are you using it in Angular in anything in production, or is it just like you're the library author sending it out into the world to be used?
Right now, I'm actually, I don't have the time to be using it myself. Like, outside of work, I'm spending all of my time like developing the library. But I do know a handful of people that have got this into production now. I know some people building their startups around it, and yeah, like I'm not using it that much right now, which is why I need more people. I need more people, more experience reports, more users.
Right. Well, then hopefully this little conversation will inspire a few people to go and give it a try, and then track you down with feedback.
Yeah, I hope so.
So at which point we should probably let you get back to writing the library and let them get started. Hayleigh, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Cheers. Thank you, Hayleigh. If you want to give Lustre a try, there are links in the show notes. And if you're Googling for it, it's Lustre. If you want to give Gleam a try, Lustre is a very nice gateway drug into Gleam's world and thereby into the world of Erlang, so give that a try. And if you just want a nice place to hang out, the Gleam Discord has some great people, including Hayleigh and more. As this episode goes live, I will be at the GoTo conference in Copenhagen, so just on the off chance, if you happen to be there, come and say hi. And if not, I have every intention of coming back with some new guests, so you won't miss out. So stay tuned for that. Make sure you're subscribed, and we'll be back soon. I've been your host, Chris Jenkins. This has been Developer Voices with Hayleigh Thompson. Thanks for listening.